Hello, everyone. Happy Independent Bookstore Day, and welcome to our Feminist World Building YA Fiction panel. We are so thrilled to have these authors with us today. We feel really fortunate, and I want to thank all of you for supporting independent bookstores and for being with us today and sharing your process and your thinking and your creative minds. And I just want to let you know also that books by all of these authors are available at your local independent bookstore, either online or in store if you have one that you can get to, and that we hope that you support both indie bookstores and all the wonderful authors that we have with us today. If you have a question for any of the authors, there's a Q&A panel, so please type those in at any time throughout the presentation. And Abby there's Abby, we'll get to them at some point during the next hour. So thanks again for joining, and I'm gonna let Abby take it away.
Hi, everybody. Thanks so much for attending here today. I'm so excited to be talking with all of these authors who are incredible and have written such incredible works. So we've got today here with us, we have Kat Cho, the author of Wicked Fox and the forthcoming Vicious Spirits. We have Rena Barron, author of Kingdom of Souls and the upcoming Reaper of Souls. And we have Rebecca Kim Wells, author of Shatter the Sky and the forthcoming Storm the Earth, which I believe is out next month. Is that right, Rebecca? Or
oh my
October?
God, it's not September yet. It's October 13th.
Yeah. October 13th, so real soon. Get to look forward to that. So yeah, guys, you have all written such truly incredible like fantasy novels that are like really just kind of like blowing the gate open in terms of like what feels like is possible in like YA fantasy right now. What drew you to fantasy in the first place?
I could go first. I always feel like the first question we're like, how is this gonna go? Like, are we gonna get all on like in class? But yeah, fantasy for me when I was younger was kind of a way to imagine a diverse world without the word diversity being used. Because I think when I was a kid, there really weren't a lot of books. I mean, there weren't a lot of books with people who looked like me in them. And in a fantasy world, like they're not, the races or like the kingdoms that are used are like not always completely parallel to our world. Of course, there's influences, like a lot of them are influenced by Western European cultures or Greco-Roman cultures or things like that. But we could still kind of play around with it in our minds a little bit. And so it was easier for me to be like, I'm an elf, than for me to be like, I'm this contemporary character that doesn't look or think or really act like me at all. So it's kind of nice. And I do think that there's a long history of fantasy and science fiction, like any speculative genre, kind of tackling topics of inequality that was harder at the time for contemporary stories to tell. The famous one being like Star Trek did a lot of things that were direct parallels to racism. And it was kind of just nice to be able to talk about those things theoretically, but with like kind of a sci-fi fantasy twist.
Absolutely.
I'll definitely jump in and build off of what Kat said. I definitely grew up with not really seeing a lot of books that represented me, but I was always a really big sci-fi and fantasy fan. And Kat mentioned Star Trek, and I'm a huge Trekkie, and I still watch Star Trek reruns on Netflix. I have no shame at all. But
nor should you.
I saw myself in a Geordie LaForge and wanting to have this, wanting to write stories in which I can imagine a Black girl like me doing anything, being the superhero, being the center of my own stories, riding dragons, taming magic, anything that I saw in books growing up, but never saw myself. And then a lot of people say, well, in fantasy, well, why does diversity matters? Well, it matters in any story for people to see themselves reflected in the story. But I remember there was a point in my childhood when I was reading all these great fantasy books and just really, really excited about them, where I just stopped and realized there's no one that looks like me in any of these stories. And I felt like some kind of way about it. I felt very absent and very invisible in a sense. So when I chose to write fantasy, I wanted to write stories about Black girls doing all these fantastic things that I saw growing up, in books that were about more just white kids. And so just really mixing it up and saying like, we all can have that experience. So that's what drew me to fantasy.
I had a very similar experience. I love sci-fi and fantasy. That's like my home genre. And it always felt easier for me to write because you can just do whatever you want. You don't have to adhere to the rules of like the real world. And then when I started like thinking seriously about writing it myself, I thought about how do I put people like me into those stories? Not that there were none, but you know, I'm a queer biracial person and there aren't, you know, I mean, there are more now, but you know, a couple years back, there weren't quite as many. And I was like, you know what, like, it's my story. I can do what I want. And that's kind of how that happened.
That's like the beauty of it, is you get to just like build something from scratch and you get to make it into whatever you want it to be. And what you all chose specifically like for your books was like this really upfront like feminist take on like these like really like what feels like traditional fantasy tropes. Like you just like turn those completely on their head and like you did something like really like new and interesting with them. So what is it about like your fantasy specifically that makes it feminist?
I would say, sorry.
Go, Rebecca.
I've been thinking about this question actually ever since I was invited to be on this panel. And I would say, you know, feminism is very complicated in some ways. There are a lot of people who are left out of the term that we generally think of when we think of feminism. Like, for example, we have this big anniversary of like women getting the right to vote in this country, which, you know, we think of as like, oh yes, all women got to the right to vote 100 years ago, but that's not actually true. Right. So thinking about like my own story, in some ways, I would say it's not like falling quite under the definition of feminism. Like there's still definitely like classism, there's some racism, there are paths that women can't quite cross. But, you know, what I wanted to do was show a place where women can be powerful and they're not punished for that, and show a character, my main character, Marin, is someone who, as she grows to understand and use her own power, starts to challenge some of those systems that have been set up to keep people like her from achieving that. So it's complicated, is my answer.
Yeah, I would add to what Rebecca said that I think the term feminist and feminism changes or has changed over the years. And I think it means a lot of different things to a lot of people. It can be exclusive in some senses. And for Kingdom of Souls, with my main character, Ara, it's very similar to what Rebecca said. It is the fighting against kind of, you know, the standards of what's considered okay, to say that the way the world works right now, I don't agree with it, and I'm going to do something, you know, to change it. And then there's classism in the story as well. The women in my story definitely, you know, it's split between kind of this kingdom where things are just a little bit more progressive and women have the ability to kind of grow into any role they want and any political standing. But there's always kind of this like barrier and what women have to overcome to kind of make, you know, themselves kind of like not feel like they're being held back. And I think there's just a lot towards, you know, saying that I'm not okay with the status quo. I'm not okay with this thing, and really doing something actively to change it, but not just for yourself. Because that's where sometimes I think when we think of feminism, it becomes, you know, sometimes it's very narrow. It's not really just about yourself. It's about looking at the greater good for more than just yourself, for everyone. The main character, Ara, she does something extreme. She trades years off of her life to get this magic. So it's a trade she makes to be able to get magic to save kids in her city. They're not her kids. They're not anyone that are actually related to her at all. But it is this ideal that of uplifting not only yourself, but those that are around you.
Mm-hmm.
I love that. I really love that message. And it also kind of just, I love what you said about how feminism as a concept is ever changing and evolving. And I think that we're at a point now where, you know, the language that we've chosen or was chosen for this movement when it, you know, first started, seems not to encompass everything that feminism does mean to people. Because at the end of the day, I think the problem is that people think feminism means like that women are angry and that we're like fighting against like the man. But the feminism, for me at least, has always meant a fight for equity and equality. And that people who have been marginalized in the past, both like individually and systemically, have a right to fight for their rights.
Mm-hmm.
And I think so in that way, like feminism does include people who aren't biologically women, or I hate the word biologically, people who are non-binary, like trans women, like anyone who believes in the idea that despite any kind of gender labels, that we deserve equality and equity. And in that sense, it's kind of like a fight that like is really worth everybody fighting for, no matter like, you know, how you identify. And so in that sense, I feel like it's something that I definitely wanted all of my characters to kind of embody in one way or the other. And I wanted to kind of have characters that were traditionally like those types of male characters that might have had problematic like mindsets in traditional fantasy or traditional like romance, because mine's a fantasy romance. And one of those characters is definitely Juno, who's a side character in the first book, but in the second book, he is a main character POV. And he does show up as this guy who's kind of this cocky dude who like gets whatever he wants. He's so attractive. He says these pithy one-liners. He's very comfortable in his like sexuality and his sexual presence because he's an immortal. But I kind of wanted in the second book to kind of explore who he actually is, like versus who he comes across as. And it was really important for me to show that he has respect for the female characters in the book, despite his like cocky, like alpha male type of persona that he puts forward. I also kind of wanted to unpack the idea of female relationships with other females in a lot of ways, and the fact that sometimes that oftentimes we're so okay with like two girls fighting merely because they happen to be two girls taking up the same space. And I feel like that's a very toxic mindset. And so my hope was, and because there are girls in the book who do fight each other, like they have issues with each other, like for a reason only of like, I don't like your face, but like I do want to unpack the facts that like that's allowed in like, because it does happen, but it's not like all girls hate each other just because we're girls and just because like we think we like the same guy or we like the same person. So I kind of wanted to create female relationships that were flawed and complex in that sense, which I did with my main character in the first book, Myung, and my main character in the second book, Somin. So the feminism is much more subtle, I would say, in my book, but it's something that I was constantly thinking about.
It's interesting that you're talking about like the friction between like your girl and your women characters, because Rebecca, you mentioned this in our earlier conversation. The relationship between your main character and her mother is very fraught. And Rena, this is present in your book as well, where that tension, that friction is very much there, and like the complicated relationships that girls have with their mothers is very much like a core theme of your books. I was wondering if you could talk a little bit more about that.
Yeah, I'll definitely start with that. As many people who read my book know, that Ara and her mother, RT, do not have a good relationship. It's interesting because I think a lot of times in what I have read in the past is that you have these perfect parents, or the relationship have superficial flaws. So nothing that's very deep. And I do think that there was a huge gap, or there is still a little bit of a gap in the industry to how we treat parents. Oftentimes, and we do know in YA fantasy, parents are absent, so they're just not there at all just because of the type of book it is. But I definitely wanted to explore Ara's coming of age in the sense of being someone like, so her mother is this, she's the third most powerful person in the country. She's very revered and well respected. She's, you know, she's magical. She's like, she's a high priestess. She just is, people look up to her as this person who is just special and perfect. And then her daughter has no magic at all. So it creates this friction of, I want to be like my mom. I want to, you know, have this magic, but I also want to be myself and enjoy my life as I, you know, as it is. And her mother is very much like, hey, you're a little bit less than, in a sense, because you're not living up to expectations. And I do think that really plays into feminism as well. What is the expectation of what it means to be a woman, or what it means to have these ideals, and really pushing against them and saying that I create my own expectations for myself, and I define what feminism is, and which is a little bit what we were talking about earlier, is that there is no one definition and there's no one right or wrong, and it's expanding. And I think the main character in my story, you know, being that, you know, she's kind of seeing what her mother and the ideal of kind of what this perfect woman is in their world, and finding her own way. And finding her own strengths that are not related to her mother, and just coming into that on her own. It's not an easy journey for her. It's very difficult, and lots of things happen. But it is a journey that she has to take. And I think that's part of what, when we think about feminist novels, is allowing the women in their novels to just go on their journey, take their journey, run into the trials and tribulations and the mistakes, and let them do it. Like, don't hold them back. And I think that like in our stories, that's super important, because there's a layer of discovery that happens and kind of finding your own way.
Yeah, I think that's really interesting, because I definitely didn't realize that I was doing this while I was writing the book, but afterwards I looked back and I realized a lot of the feelings I gave Myung, my main Gumiho character, was feelings I feel as a kid that grew up in the diaspora. And she's not a diaspora Korean kid. She was born and raised in South Korea, and so is everyone in the book. But at the same time, Myung is the one character who kind of grows up between two worlds. And so I definitely, whether I meant to or not, drew on some of my own experiences. And a lot of those have to do with like the difference between generational thinking, like how my parents felt immigrating to America, and how and what they had to do in order to find any type of success in this country, versus how my sister and I felt being of a new generation, and kind of like, you know, living this life where our parents represented one culture and were telling us what they had to do to survive, and us kind of like seeing a different path, but like having it be very hard to articulate, because, you know, in Korean culture still to this day, there's a lot of expectation of filial piety, where we show respect to our elders, we honor our family, we honor our parents, and it's obviously changing and evolving, but it's still there. And so I felt like Myung felt that from her mother, who's a gumiho, who's been alive for like 1,000 years. So she has very strict viewpoints of like how you survive in this country, where like for the last like 1,000 years, it was so patriarchal. You know, there was a lot of like preconceived expectations of what a woman's place was, especially a beautiful woman. And so Yena, her mother, had evolved certain survival instincts because of that. And her daughter Myung is her most precious like person, the most precious thing to her in this world. So she's very strict. And it comes from a place of love, but she's also like a murderous fox spirit. So like she expresses herself in very ways. But Myung having, you know, been born in the modern era, you know, and a time where people are so interconnected and where people are a little bit more open-minded, and, you know, especially in South Korea, which was like in the past, I would say like 70 years has like grown exponentially, you know, since the end of the Korean War, like completely modernized, embraced a lot of technology, become like one of the fastest growing like entertainment businesses in the world. Like really, it's the rate at which South Korea has evolved and changed is astronomical in the past few decades. And so for me, I'm growing up during a time where like so much has changed. She sees it differently about how she can survive in this world. And that causes her to not agree with everything her mother wants of her and causes a friction between them. But then you layer on the whole parental expectations and what I was saying, like the filial piety and everything like that, and the life and death consequences of it. It does cause a lot of friction between Myung and her mother. But the relationship is rooted in love.
And that's all we can ask for. It's that feels in its own way like it's very you know, talking about forging your own path, like in this, like, you know, like going against the establishment and making your own way for something that like a society that places its own expectations on you based on your race, your gender, your sexuality, and then like forging your own path that feels very reflected in their relationships, like with their mothers, where it's like they are the old guard and this is okay, well, we're going to do something new now. And that rejection of like the standard is something that's like a common thread between all three of your characters, I think. And I was really struck by like how intensely fueled by like their inner like emotional lives all of your characters were, especially like Rebecca, I saw this especially in your book where, I mean, you pitched it initially as like, you know, angry bisexual feminist dragon book, and it's like, yeah, that's exactly what I'm looking for. But it's like that rage that also like lives at the intersection of like fear of like, what is going on, what am I meant to do, I'm going into this unknown territory, like this is where your characters live. So like what was that like, you know, writing at this intersection of like, how do you balance that, and what did it feel like to like write a character who expresses their anger, and then like you said, Rebecca, you know, power without punishment, who expresses their anger and that's used as fuel, and it's not a flaw necessarily, it's something that is necessary to like drive the plot forward.
Well, I think that is, you know, going back to this idea of like feminism as like angry women. I think that's kind of essential. Like that, you know, not to draw extreme generalizations, but generally speaking, at least in the United States, men are sort of taught that their emotions are the important ones, and a lot of times their emotions get expressed via anger and rudeness and etc. And that's just like developed into a stereotype of like, oh, that's the way men are, when that's not quite true, right? And then women are, generally speaking, you sort of think of like, oh, the perfect woman is, you know, like calm and placating and logical and, you know, making the peace. And I think an essential part of moving the world forward is expressing the idea that all people can be all things. And women should not be punished for their anger. In fact, their anger is many times essential and appropriate. So, you know, when I was writing Shatter the Sky, Marin, she starts off just as a girl who actually doesn't have many grand plans. She's very happy with her quiet little life. And then when the inciting incident of the book is that her girlfriend gets kidnapped by agents of the emperor and taken away, and she has to make a decision to go down the mountain and try to get her back. And so that's like the initial spark of like this sense of injustice that she feels. Why has her girlfriend been taken away? She has to get her back. And then as she goes down, her journey becomes learning about how many things are wrong in this empire that she's been removed from. And all of that, of course, makes her even more angry. So, of course, she's not punished for her anger. Her anger is entirely justified by the world in which she lives, and she uses it very well, I think.
And then we have Myung, who is a murderous fox spirit who eats evil men for their energy.
She does. Everyone has flaws. No, yeah, I would say that, yeah, as I was listening to Rebecca talk about like how women are punished for being angry, I just kept on thinking about the intersectionality with that too, of like women are punished for being angry, but also women of color have an extra layer, like Black women, Indigenous women, Asian women, like, and it's also different. Like, it's like an Asian woman isn't punished the same way that a Black woman is, obviously, but there's all these added layers on top of it. I would say, speaking from just the POV of an Asian woman, is that we do have a cultural identity of like stoicism and like of us being calm and quiet and subservient. And part of that is because like our root culture is one that was built on patriarchy for like the past like 1,000 years, and Confucianism and stuff like that. So it's really hard, because I think that people are like, oh, if she's so loud, she's not as authentically Asian, which I've heard about myself. Like, people are like, oh, you're so American because you're so loud. And I was like, my loudness does not stem from my Americanness. It's who I would be no matter where in the world I was born. So it does bother me that like I have to think about those different layers, but it also kind of drove my creativeness, I would say, too. And in a way, like one character, Soman, who's a very loud person, and she kind of like she literally beats people up at school if they do something, unfair. She fights for justice, but she also physically fights. She was kind of my screw you, to people who think that like Asian women have to be quiet and subservient all the time. Like, Soman is very, very, very Korean, but she also doesn't take anyone's BS. But I kind of forgot the root of this question.
It's talking about like anger and like how that feel, like how cathartic it must be to be able to just write that and do what you're doing.
Yeah. So definitely all of my female characters feel anger in some way or another about how society pushes them down. I do think that part of it also, I tried to root it in the idea that a lot of these myths paint. So the myth of the Gumiho, in most of them, the Gumiho is always a female, and she's always evil. And I felt that was so unfair, because I was like, how come, this evil woman, and I was like, why is she evil? Let me look at the individual stories. And it's like, oh, because she seduced a married man, like, okay, I'm sorry, he's the one who's married. One of them was like a scholar tries to steal her fox bead, which everyone believes is like the root of all knowledge. And then she punished him for it. I'm like, he stole from her. So it made me so mad. I was like, of course this is how she's painted, because men wrote these stories, and she's a beautiful woman who's not sorry for being beautiful. So I also kind of wanted to do a little spin on that. And I have to admit, I got a little mad. Myself.
Sounds about right. And Rena, Ara, she's interesting because I feel like a lot of her anger is almost like internalized in a way. Like, she's angry with herself for like not being able to live up to like these expectations that are placed on her. And like, how does that like drive her? How does that fuel her?
Yeah, I think in general, just a lot of my women characters, the one thing that I wanted to make sure is to have diversity of thought and in the way that they deal with different situations. And for Ara, it very much is a feeling disappointed that she doesn't have magic, but being very much the person who, I don't have this thing, but I'm not going to let that bring me down. I'm not going to let that stop my determination. As I say a lot with Ara, her greatest strength has nothing to do with magic. It has to do with her determination and her willingness to um, go against the odds, to make the things that she wants to happen, the willingness to fight against the establishment, as we said earlier. So yeah, there's definitely some internalized anger, because it's like, you know, pushing against something that seems insurmountable, and just like something I feel like I may not be able to win against, but still pushing. And I think that's an important factor just in her characterization, is that she's not someone who's going to give up. And she will do, I mean, she makes mistakes, but she's doing everything that, you know, all of her decisions are made with the best intentions. While I do have other characters, and I don't want to name them because I'll give away spoilers for the book, who are women who take their fight against the establishment a very different way, and take that. So it's not really internal anger, it's very external, and they use their power in not the best ways. And I think it's important for women in stories to be allowed to be any type of characters. They don't need to always necessarily be like, you know, both Kat and Rebecca were saying earlier, this ideal that women have to be a certain way, meek and quiet. I don't subscribe to any of that, because I think, just like, you know, in real life, people have different opinions, and they have different ways of behavior, and different ways they interact and react to things. And so one thing that's very important in Kingdom of Souls is that I have a lot of women in the story, and they all have agendas, and their agendas are very, very different, based on what they want to get. But that was really the important kind of basis of when I thought about what feminism means in this story, is that all of these women have their roles and their agendas, and it's all about them getting what they want. And you know what, I'm okay with that, because this whole ideal that males or men go after what they want and they're climbing that ladder, well, I believe that it's equal, you know, that women are doing the exact same thing, and sometimes not in the nicest ways, and that's okay. That makes it a little bit more interesting.
Like, you can generate like a personality trait and desires all on your own, like just from your own person. Imagine that. Incredible.
Right. Weird.
Weird how people can do that. So I'm curious now, because you all have such like strong, like real like senses of like who your characters are, and like where they fit like into these worlds. And so I'm curious about, like, just in terms of like craft, where you started with your stories. Like, did you have like the world building in mind first? Did you have the plot first? Was it character? Like, where did that all come from?
I can go
Mine was
first.
character. Yeah.
Okay, Kat's going.
Mine was character first, and it's because it was like I wanted to tell a modern retelling of the myth of the Gumiho. So like the idea of this girl who has to prey off of humans in order to survive, and very much like kind of how we see like modern day like vampire stories, and it came from the idea that like a lot of like the myths of the Gumiho, they live in like a secluded mountain cabin, and they like lure in travelers like who are traveling on foot who will never be missed. But as like Korea has gotten modernized, like people don't like hike the mountain, you know, to get to the next city anymore. So like they would have to shift with the times, and like how would that look, and what would it feel like to have to now live amongst the people that you are preying on, whereas before they didn't have to do that, and how would that change a Gumiho's point of view. And originally it was so like Mi-young, the main character, she's 18. She was born like 18 years ago. But at first, my main character was someone who's been alive for like 100 years and looks like an 18-year-old. And because I wanted her to like have to have shifted with the times, I did end up like abandoning that. But it was, I kept on like thinking of like how would her mindset like be different than her mother's, who did live at the time where like she could just live in her cabin and not have to worry about like the families like mourning her victims and stuff like that, whereas Mi-young has to do it. So I built it up around those two characters.
Very cool.
Okay, I'll go. My world came Well, it came from the premise, pretty much. I was writing Shatter This Guy. I was licking my wounds from a book that had gone on submission and didn't sell. And I was very sad about that. And I was like, okay, like I have to start writing another book. Where do I start? I don't know. And I was reading a lot of nonfiction at the time. And I read Mark Kurlansky's Salt, which is a microhistory of the world, like telling the story of humans, but like specifically about how the way salt shapes their lives. And there was a story in there about like a town, and their entire like industry was the production of salt. And I was like, that's interesting. What happens when it goes away if you're like a single industry town, which, you know, there are many towns that are like that with various industries. And because I'm a fantasy writer, of course, then it was like, what of that but dragons? And then I was also reading this memoir, an adult memoir by Alyssa Harad, which is called Coming to My Senses, not the Alice Waters memoir. But this one is about this woman sort of like thinking about different modes of femininity as she's like getting ready to be married, and also thinking about like perfume and scent and personal, and it's a bad pitch that I just gave, but it was a very interesting memoir, and I got like sucked into perfume. Basically, I fell down a huge perfume hole, and to tell you exactly what that inspired in Shatter This Guy would be a little bit of a spoiler, but I kind of mashed those things together. And then I was like, okay, the dragons are gone from this town. Why? What happened? Who took them? Is that bad? Do we care? And then sort of answering those questions started leading to the book.
So you had like your concept and like built the world around it and then populated that world.
Yes.
Very cool. Rena?
For Kingdom of Souls, the book really started as an ideal when I was very, very young. I grew up in Alabama, small town, Christian society, and then I heard stories about people who did voodoo in my community. And not really understanding that, but always hearing these stories where they were negative, they were bad, and it was something that was very frightening to me, but it was also very intriguing, and it always kind of stuck with in my mind. And you know, kind of growing up and understanding where that came from and my family's West African roots, then I realized, oh, I'm kind of stuck between two worlds here, being an American, but then having those roots and not really understanding everything about it. And so that ideal kind of stuck with me for a very long time, kind of just ruminating on it, and it grew into this ideal of Ara being this person stuck between two worlds, because her parents are from the tribal land, so they're outside of the kingdom. So she grew up and was born in the kingdom. Her parents are from a different land. Her ancestors speak a different language. She doesn't have the magic that they have, so she feels very caught in between, and that is very much a representation of myself. And so that story was kind of growing in the background. So I came up with the premise of, you know, well, what happens if you have this person who is in between, who doesn't have the magic and that she needs, and to be fully engrossed in her family's culture. And what if there's an evil demon king that she has to stop on top of it? See, that's where the fantasy part comes in, right? It's just like a demon king. And so I definitely had like this premise that evolved over a very, very long time to become Kingdom of Souls. And I ended up building out this whole huge world around that. But it really started with the premise, and the world grew from there.
That's truly one of my favorite things about fantasy is you take like this real like inherent like existential problem, and you're like, but what if we added this other thing and really like upped the stakes, and it just makes everything so much more like dramatic and interesting and intense. It's so good. So then, because now you all have sequels to your books coming out, and that is now its own kettle of fish, because you have this established world that you've done, and now you have to continue the story, and you're working within this world that you already made. So how is that different from like your first draft of the first book, like, you know, really coming up with everything on the spot?
It was easier.
Really?
I mean, some things about writing the second book were much harder. Don't get me wrong. The fact that I had to write it in 1 year, whereas I wrote the first book in 3 years, that was very difficult.
Sure.
But in terms of like world building, that was much easier. I felt very comfortable of like playing in the same world because I had always intended the book to be a duology. So because of that, I didn't know exactly what was going to happen, but I had planned the world with that in mind. So I didn't have to make up quite so much as I was doing it. So I feel good about that. Good choices.
I love that for you.
Yeah.
One of my personal theories about a sequel is the idea that you have to take the established rules and you have to break them, but like in a creative way. And so I think one of the challenges for me was that I wanted to kind of show how these rules were able to be kind of like twisted a little bit by the characters in the second book without it being so convoluted that the readers wouldn't be able to follow my line of thinking, which can happen in fantasy. Like you get really into the nitty gritty of the magic system and then you realize like you forgot to like actually pull the readers in emotionally. It's a very like Star Wars midichlorian issue. But yeah, so with Vicious Spirits, I definitely wanted to expand on the world because in book 1 is just the Gumiho myth. And so in the second book, I added 2 new mythologies. One is Dokebi, which is a Korean goblin. The other one's the Josung Saja, which is a Korean reaper. And I kind of used those to build the world out a little bit to be bigger than just like the fox spirit mythology. And then I used like those myths to kind of like show a different angle to like the fox spirit and how she exists in the world.
Combination of that and a reaper is very, very intriguing to me. I'm excited about that.
Yeah.
And Rena, no spoilers, but your book ends on such a cliffhanger. Truly such a cliffhanger. Where is it? What's going on?
Oh gosh, yes. So it's really hard to talk about my book too because there's so so much happens at the very end. But very similar to Kat, I've built out this really big, what I believe to be very lush world in Kingdom of Souls, but I did actually expand quite a bit on what that world is. One of the things that you get in the first book, just in little snippets, is point of views from the gods in the stories and how they're related with Ara and the history of the bigger story about the demon kings and Orisha and this like kind of 5,000-year battle. I really expand on that and give a different perspective of what's happening there. Some more secrets are happening, some more twists and turns as usual for my stuff. But I really enjoy having the base kind of built out in the first book in Kingdom of Souls and then taking Reaper and saying, I'm going to build this and make it even larger. Because that's something that's, for me, like I've always wanted within something I've always liked in the fantasies that I did read were these immense worlds that keep expanding and have these twists and turns and are not limited. I mean, I didn't want that for my characters as well. So I just kind of kept building upon that. So let's just say there are multiple worlds in book 2, A Reaper of Souls. So things change quite a bit.
Well,
can I say something right now? I have to say, I finished reading it this morning in preparation for this panel, and I was like, that scream emoji that's like, oh my God, what is happening? And immediately I wanted to turn around and start from the beginning again, because there's so much that gets revealed over the course of the book that I thought you did such a good job, like planting from the beginning. Oh my gosh.
It's like strewing those breadcrumbs.
I feel so emotional about
It's like in the last 50 pages, you get the rug ripped out from under. You're like, I don't know anything anymore. It's incredible.
Well, I hope that happens for book 2 at Reaper of Souls. I'm shooting for that response.
Looking forward to it. All right, so we've got about 10 minutes left. I wanted to get some of the audience questions answered here. So we have from Rena, we have to everyone. I hope you're all doing well. What are your go-to online resources for researching the cultures that you draw on?
don't know if I have one go-to resource. I think that's very difficult. I think if you're doing researching in general, you should be looking at a lot of different places to make sure you're getting very different viewpoints. For myself, just as I mentioned earlier, the basis of Kingdom of Souls drew on kind of my own culture and my own childhood and these stories that I heard growing up. But then beyond that, definitely like, you know, checking out books in the library on the culture that you're writing about. And of course, being respectful, because I think that's the biggest thing. It's not like we are just kind of picking and choosing to write about different cultures. I think, at least this panel, all of our stories are very personal to our own culture and draw from that. So that's part of it, is, you know, being authentic to the story and thinking about that foremost.
Yeah, I think it's hard because a lot of my inspiration was from myths and stories that I'd been hearing since I was a little girl. So when I first like outlined the idea for the book, I didn't do any initial outside research. I just like literally wrote it down from like my memories and my knowledge of the myths. But as I got more into it, I definitely wanted to have more actual like texts to back it up, especially because I had some interstitials that are like actual mythology and that take place during actual Korean history. And in that, I definitely went to just like original texts that were written like in Korea and then translated to English. That was something that I wanted to definitely do. And it's not necessary for anyone, but I just really wanted to find it from the point of view of a Korean scholar. It just felt more important to me at the time. So I definitely spent a lot of time like scouring the libraries and stuff for things like that, maybe longer than I needed to be honest, because a lot of those things like ended up like getting cut from the book. I was like so proud of my historical context, and then it just didn't work. But I liked it for my own personal knowledge because I know that all the pieces kind of like fit well together in that sense. I do think it's hard, the idea, this question about research, because I definitely think people have to do research if they're writing about an underrepresented culture, even if it's your own culture. But I also think that there's no how-to guide, you know. It's hard. Like I always try to answer this question to the best of my ability, but it's kind of like, well, why are you asking the question? Is what I would want to ask back to the person. Is it because you're trying to write about a culture that you're not innately familiar with? Because then I would ask you to go back to your core reasons for writing this story and why you think the story needs to be told and why you are so passionate about telling it, and kind of unpack that and explore that a little bit, because I think if you find out the reason why you want to tell it, then that will dictate like how your research is done. If it's because you're like fascinated with like how war plays out in like this area or something like that, then you'd want to look at more war texts. Or if you want to talk about the family unit during times of strife, then you might want to find like diaries and journals and stuff. So it's hard.
It is very hard. I am answering this question from the perspective of a book that I haven't written yet, but I'm like just in the very beginnings of trying to research it. I have no idea. This is like very insider information. You're getting a treat right now. But I've been considering writing a book that involves Korea, because that's my background, but also I know very little about Korea. So even though like it is my personal heritage, I am like, I can't even start writing this book until I really do at least like several months of intensive research. That's where I am right now. And I have looked around. I've asked my family for recommendations for books and like movies and media to watch. And I've been, doing a lot of Googling about, books on Korea generally, and more specifically stuff that I'm particularly interested in. And I will tell you, perhaps my one tip that hasn't completely been touched upon yet is not just to look at, does this cover the subject that I'm interested in, but also who is writing it. I've certainly read some stuff on Korea that I picked up because it was very highly rated on Goodreads, and I started reading it and I was like, a white man wrote this who's basically fetishizing Korean women, and it's very obvious that this is going on, to me at least. And then I put it away and I was like, some things in the book I was like, okay, like now I know directions to take my research, but overall I don't trust this person on their perspective. So this is true for any media that you consume, is not just looking at what it is on the page, but also who has created it and why are they qualified to do it, and what are their perspectives, what might their motivations be for doing it. So that's my suggestion.
Yeah, I definitely agree with that. I think that the publishing industry is still having a reckoning with books that have come out, even in the recent past, that were lauded for, great diversity representation, and now finally people are like, people from the community are like, actually that's really bad representation. Like the biggest example I can think of is Memoirs of a Geisha.
Yeah.
When it came out and when that movie was made, people were like, this is fascinating, the life of a true geisha. It's written by a white man, and it actually has a lot of inaccuracies, as opposed to a book that came out written by an actual geisha called Geisha Alive. And no one talked about it. No one had heard about it. But like that one is it doesn't have as high ratings, but that one's way more accurate and authentic and is an important story. So I 100% agree with what Rebecca said.
From Everett Smith, did you ever have a hard time committing to the book you were writing?
Well, writing a book is hard. I don't think I've ever met a fellow writer who's like, isn't writing so easy? Like, and if I ever meet someone like that, I'm gonna definitely be like, are you okay? You definitely have some PTSD or something.
Oh no.
But no, writing a book is really hard. It's not always fun. There's going to be points where you're over it, or where it's not going right, and where you don't want to try anymore. Like every writer goes through that, however many books they have out published. I think the biggest thing is that you have to know yourself really well. I know there's a lot of things about like, this is my writing process, and like there's author tube, and there are people who are like, I'm going to write like Stephen King for a week. I'm going to write like, Nora Roberts for a week, as like fun thought exercises. But at the end of all of them, they're like, it felt so unnatural. So, and it is because it's true. So I think, take the breaks you need, find the inspiration and the motivation you need. Realize that writing is not a solitary task. You need friends, and you need critique partners and readers. And don't self-reject is the biggest thing, I think. It's like our worst enemy is ourself when we're writing. So perseverance and all that fun stuff.
And I would definitely add to that, don't be afraid of rejection and failure. There is a lot of rejection and failure throughout the writing process, especially if you're choosing to go the traditional publishing route. And just know that no one's first draft is great. It's horrible. It's called a trash draft for a reason, and it's okay. And again, for what Kat said, write in your own way that makes the most sense for you. I remember early on in my career, and I'd been rejected a lot of times through querying, and I said, I'm on the Stephen King path. I think it was like his 7th book or something got published. So I just kind of just made that up for myself. I'm like, I'm on the Stephen King path. So I'll get my 7th book I think it was my 4th. I don't know, somewhere around there. So really,
you're better than Stephen King.
I'm better than Stephen King.
Done.
See that, Stephen King. But really just finding your own path and not trying to follow someone else's path. And you hear this, eyes on your own paper, and wow, that really, really, like, if the one thing I would say to people, don't compare yourself to other people and what they're doing and their goals. Make your own.
I think those are both excellent answers. And the only thing I would add to that is if you're struggling to commit to a project because you have like too many ideas, you just have to suck it up and do it. But also B, many writers do work on multiple projects at once. So if you can narrow it down to like, a couple, then it's like, okay, this is my main project, but I'm also going to devote maybe like 30 minutes a day or whatever to the second project that I'm super excited about. I'm actually trying to do that right now. It's not going very well, but many people do this successfully. So, you don't have to be like, oh, I can never explore my other ideas until I'm done with this one. Just all in moderation.
Yeah, I could see Rena slowly dying inside when you said that, because she literally had to do that. And this is the thing, is like sometimes when we're under contract for more than one book, we literally have to do it. We're contractually obligated to do it. And I know that's been your life for like the past 2 years, Rena.
Yeah.
Oh no.
Well, I'm also, and I'm contracted under 2-3 book deals. So I'm going back to back with my middle grade and then the YA. I am very much obsessed with one story person though. So I can't really go back and forth between books. So when I'm focusing on my YA, so like I'm just 100% on that mindset and that story. And then I turn that draft in and then I go to my middle grade and I'm 100% on that story. But before it was just like one story and it had to be the one story. But so now that I am under contract, I've learned to compartmentalize it a little bit where I'm just like, okay, for this 2 months, I'm focusing on Reaper of Soul. Then I'm focusing on Maya and the Rising Dark. So you can adjust and grow depending on the situation as well.
Character development.
I hate to be the one to break in and say we're out of time, but the role, it falls upon me. You guys are all so smart and thoughtful, and this was just wonderful. I'm so appreciative for you showing up today and having this conversation. I want to wish you a happy Independent Bookstore Day, and just thank you all again, and remind our audience members that all of the books by all of these women are available at indie bookstores. If you have a book, hold them up if you have it up. And indie bookstores either online or in person. And we hope you continue to celebrate Indie Bookstore Day today. And thanks again. Bye.
Thanks, everybody.
Thank you. Thanks so much.